When paradise comes with a price tag that locals can't afford, something fundamental breaks in the equation between prosperity and community. Welcome back to The Rise the Limit, where today we explore Chapter 1, An Invisible Hand in My Pocket. Our story unfolds on Emancipation Day in the Turks and Caicos, where former salt workers once built self-sufficient communities through sheer determination, only to watch their descendants priced out by the very tourism boom meant to lift all boats. From a $240 dinner to the stark choice between inconsistent local service and sterile luxury, this is a tale of economic forces that reshape entire cultures while travelers remain blissfully unaware of the hidden costs of their escape. An invisible hand in my pocket. Turks and Caicos, unveiling paradise's true cost. We look at the Caribbean and see jewels dropped into the Atlantic, a construct built for the specific purpose of making us forget what day of the week it is. We go there to disappear, to float in a warm suspension removed from the relentless linear march of invoices and emails. But paradise is not a natural phenomenon. It is a construction project requiring zoning permits. It is raised on the bones of history, the brutal rules of nature, and the invisible machinery of modern economics. This is not just a travel guide. It is an autopsy of a destination. Through the lens of a single family trip, from the noisy energy of Providenciales to the spooky silence of the ultra-exclusive Ambergris Cay, I intended to peel back the glossy layers of the postcard to reveal the complex breathing world underneath. I felt like a forensic pathologist, but with better swimwear and a piña colada in hand. For centuries, these islands were defined by what could be taken from the ocean. While landing, looking out over the salinas, I tried to picture the industry that once ruled here. The commodity chain began with the souls of the indigenous Lucayan people, extracted first. Then came the salt, raked by enslaved hands, the cotton of loyalist plantations trying to replicate the American South on a rock, and the silver of Spanish galleons wrecked on the reefs. Today the commodities have shifted from sodium and silver to silence and sunlight. Yet the dynamic remains identical. The collapse of the salt industry birthed a tourism empire, creating a paradox where the history of grueling labor is paved over by the luxury of aggressive leisure. We were mining the view just as hard as they once mined the salt. Shifting my gaze from the grand vistas to the leaf litter, I found a mirror of this human struggle in the island's reptiles. Why are the lizards so angry? The islands are not a passive backdrop, but a battlefield. In the territorial push-ups of the native anole, the voracious invasion of the lionfish, and the prehistoric resilience of the rock iguana, nature dictates that you partition or perish. The way life segregates itself, native versus invasive, visible versus hidden, offered a profound lesson in survival that made my struggle to choose a dinner restaurant feel significantly less heroic. And having stared down a rock iguana, the results are inconclusive, but they are almost certainly judging you. This biological friction bleeds directly into the economics of paradise. Why is a dinner on Grace Bay worth over $200? It is not because the lettuce is made of emeralds. The islands function on a bizarre economic logic where items become desirable specifically because they are expensive, like designer handbags or printer ink. There is a palpable tension between the belonger, looking for stability, and the transient elite, looking for isolation. I found myself wandering around a private runway that stood as the ultimate symbol of value, the ability to leave whenever one wants. From the deck of a sunken ship to the cockpit of a single-pilot plane, this became a story about the things we usually ignore while we are busy relaxing. I began this journey assuming the Caribbean was a simple equation of sand plus good food equals happiness. I assumed the high prices were merely a tourist tax and that the silence was natural. But a local historian might argue that the silence is actually the sound of displacement, and a belonger might say the cost is the price of importing a simulation of America to a limestone rock. Synthesizing these views, the reality of the Turks and Caicos is a beautifully uncomfortable friction. It is a place where biological and economic survival depends on adaptation, where the invasive species, be it a lionfish or a luxury developer, redefines the ecosystem. The salt is gone, but the extraction continues. The lizards are fighting a war you can't see. Your dinner is expensive because isolation is the ultimate luxury. Welcome to the Turks and Caicos. From Chains to Cheers, a nation's freedom song. Every revolution evaporates and leaves behind only the slime of a new bureaucracy. So wrote Kafka, a man who presumably never had to wait on a hot tarmac for a signature. My trip to the tropics began with the suffocating kindness of an early morning airport run, only for the plane to sit as a magnificent metal paperweight held hostage by a single missing signature on a maintenance form. We were an entire aircraft of travelers trapped in aluminum purgatory, our collective destiny resting on the point of a pen. Deliverance arrived not on wings, but on 4 wheels. A man in a Ford F-150 rolled up to our Leviathan, looking like he was headed to a hardware store rather than an aircraft hangar. He produced a ladder and a screwdriver with the solemnity of a priest preparing his vestments, then ambled toward the tail. I couldn't see what ancient rite he performed with his sacred implement, but it satisfied the paperwork gods. The beast roared to life and we were finally flung into the sky. The route required a brief sojourn in the underworld, otherwise known as Charlotte Douglas International Airport. I have a history with this terminal. Years ago, a flight of mine was grounded here for mechanical trouble. They sent us on our way in a different plane, but put the original aircraft back in service the next morning. It fell out of the sky. I think of this every time I walk these halls. The terminal feels like a living exhibit on the concept of in progress, where the construction walls from a decade ago remain, promising an architectural tomorrow that never quite arrives. Our next leg was a newer 737 bound for the islands. The crew seemed young to be steering a jet over the ocean, but they were efficient enough until takeoff, when they forgot to latch the metal storage cubes up front. The acceleration sent a full set crashing to the galley floor with a sound like a robot falling down a staircase. The seat next to me was empty, so I slid toward the window to escape the noise. This placed me within perfect earshot of the row behind, where a woman spent the flight systematically dismantling her husband's self-esteem, one enunciated criticism at a time. We touched down at an airport so small it felt like a suggestion rather than a major point of entry. Jets from United and JetBlue were already squatting on the tarmac. As the first passengers off our plane, we were poised for a record-setting sprint through immigration, but the JetBlue passengers had just begun to deplane. Their queue stood between us and the exit, proof of the universe's comic timing. After a slow shuffle through customs, we stepped into the warm, thick air where a driver waited to summon our taxi. We had timed our delay-riddled arrival perfectly for a history lesson. It was August 1st. In the Turks and Caicos, August 1st is Emancipation Day. It marks the moment in 1834 when the British Slavery Abolition Act took effect. Yet, as with most matters involving paperwork and power, there was a catch. The Act immediately initiated an apprenticeship, a system requiring the newly freed to continue working for their old masters. It was comparable to telling a prisoner he had been pardoned but needed to finish out the week to help with inventory. Real, actual freedom didn't arrive until 4 years later, on August 1st, 1838, for the more than 2,200 enslaved people here. This history is baked into the very soil, or rather, the salt. Bermudian colonists grew a massive salt trade on the backs of enslaved Africans, a brutal industry that defined the island's economy. After emancipation, many of these families established their own settlements with names like Bambara and Lorimers, echoes of the homes they were taken from. Their legacy continues in the annual sloop races, where the boats that were once tools for the salt industry now sail in celebration. They demonstrate that the journey from bondage to liberty was powered by skill, resilience, and a profound understanding of the sea. Staring at the back of the taxi driver's head, the day's trivial frustrations, the missing signature, the delayed planes, the immigration line, shrank in significance. What is an hour's wait on a runway compared to a 4-year wait for a promise to be fulfilled? Salt, soul, and survival, the island's unique legacy. The air rushing through the windows was a thick, warm tonic of diesel and brine, a reminder that the history here isn't just recorded in dates, but defined by geology. Unlike the big league Caribbean islands, which colonizers bulldozed into vast factories for sugar, the Turks and Caicos were deemed unsuitable for such grand-scale agriculture. Their defining features were shallow, sun-blasted ponds called salinas. This geography meant the local get-rich-quick scheme was not cane, but salt, harvested through the scientifically complex process of waiting for the water to evaporate. For the enslaved people forced into the trade, the job description involved wading in caustic brine strong enough to pickle a cucumber in seconds, scraping up heavy crystals under a sun that held a personal grudge against all life. It was Herculean labor, yet it was seasonal, creating a rhythm of life distinct from the non-stop misery of the sugar mills. That geological quirk proved to be a critical loophole in the machinery of oppression. When Britain finally emancipated its colonies, the freed population here possessed a peculiar, highly marketable set of skills: raking salt, building the shallow draft sloops needed to navigate the quays, and the seamanship to pilot them. It was as if an entire population of accountants had been freed on tax day. Their abilities were immediately, desperately in demand. This contrasted sharply with the sugar colonies, where the primary skill, surviving a full day of cutting cane, offered limited freelance potential. With their freedom secured, many of the newly liberated did not stick around to see what their former masters had planned. They looked at the archipelago's scattered geography, a beautiful array of options for social distancing, and took to their boats. They established towns on more remote islands, founding settlements like Bambara and Lorimers on Middle Caicos. They were doing more than moving house. They were staging a quiet seaward revolution. The name Bambara serves as a deliberate echo of the Bambara people of West Africa, a way of planting a flag of identity so deep it could never be washed away by the tide. In these fledgling towns, a new culture fermented. Its most famous musical product is Ripsaw, the official soundtrack of the islands. The lead instrument is not a guitar or a drum, but a carpenter's saw, played by scraping a knife or a screwdriver along the teeth. This constitutes an act of genius on par with turning a tax form into a love poem. Local law suggests the saw was a clever substitute for drums, which enslavers often forbade for fear they could be used to send messages. They were right to be afraid. People who can turn a handsaw into a rhythm section are capable of anything. This ingenuity extended beyond music. Survival in these independent outposts depended on passed-down knowledge. Oral histories, folktales, and the secrets of bush medicine became the constitution of these new societies. Generations of African herbal wisdom blended with the local flora, creating a pharmacy in the wilderness that allowed the community to endure in isolation. Roots in the land, rhythm in the soul. How does a people forged in independence hold on to the very ground beneath their feet, especially when the world they built to escape the market returns with a calculator and a purchase offer? The answer, I was beginning to learn, is complicated, fraught with paperwork, and involves fighting for the soul of the island's one dusty land claim at a time. It is a battle between memory and money. Walking the islands on Emancipation Day, it became clear that the past here is not merely a plaque on a wall, it is an active ingredient in the present. This is visible in the old settlements, founded by freed Africans on what was then useless Crown land. In those days, survival trumped bureaucracy. They established a system known as generation property, a land ownership model that operates on the legal principle of "my grandfather's grandfather planted that tree, so don't even think about it." It was a communal understanding, an oral deed passed down through stories with roots stretching back to West African traditions. This system worked perfectly until someone invented the all-inclusive resort and land values began to look like phone numbers. Suddenly, that communal legacy became a legal nightmare. Proving ownership of a plot your family has occupied for 150 years is surprisingly difficult when your only documentation is family law and a very old tamarind tree. Descendants find themselves in a peculiar bind. They are sitting on a gold mine they often cannot legally sell, mortgage, or defend from an encroaching developer armed with a surveyor and a team of smiling attorneys. The very thing that defined their freedom, owning a patch of earth, now threatens to trap them in a modern web of individual property rights. It is a legacy of self-reliance getting a crash course in contract law. This fight for the land runs in lockstep with the fight for the culture built upon it. The most famous export of this perseverance is Ripsaw music, born from that scrap metal ingenuity. Keeping this tradition alive is the work of dedicated guardians who mentor new players, ensuring the unique, scraping rhythm doesn't fade. The government intervenes here, giving the music a prime spot at national festivals. This provides a stage, introduces the sound to tourists who thought they were just getting a free rum punch, and affirms Ripsaw as the authentic soundtrack of the nation. While the Ripsaw gets the spotlight, a quieter and more desperate preservation effort takes place in the island's bush. The knowledge of medicinal plants, a direct inheritance from the first free generation's blend of African herbalism and local botany, remains an oral library stored in the minds of the elderly. This wisdom allowed people to thrive and heal themselves far from any formal doctor. To save it, organizations have started leading bushwalks, where elders guide people through the landscape to point out nature's pharmacy. It is a frantic attempt to write down a dictionary whose pages are disappearing. They are digitizing an ancestral encyclopedia before its last living librarians are gone. It is a monumental task, this expedition to save a ghost. Where everybody knows your name, or do they? Having just completed a deep dive into the spectral world of generation property and the pharmacology of local weeds, I was prepared to land in a place steeped in ancient customs and oral traditions. Instead, the country's welcome mat is an island called Providenciales, which gives the impression it was built 6 months ago by a real estate developer who won a lottery and had a deep affinity for beige stucco. Everyone calls it Provo, likely because saying Providenciales 10 times is a known cure for hiccups and a leading cause of lockjaw. Though it is not the capital, Provo is clearly where the action is. It holds the international airport, the most famous beach, and, by the looks of it, 99% of the country's concrete. It functions as the national equivalent of a household where the hyperactive, popular teenager with a booming social media presence lives in a sprawling new extension, while the actual parents reside in a quiet, drafty old room at the other end of the house. That room, 70 miles away, is Grand Turk. Its main village, Cockburn Town, was the center of the universe here for centuries, back when salt, not tourists, was the currency of the realm. It possesses charming, slightly weary Bermudian architecture and the official seat of government. It also hosts a cruise ship port, which allows thousands of people a day to briefly step into the past, buy a t-shirt, and get back on their floating buffet before the sense of quaintness becomes overwhelming. This creates a bizarre dislocation. The nation's brain, where all the laws are made, sits in a quiet historic town, while its wallet and vocal cords operate on a buzzing modern island a short flight away. Once you escape the gravitational pull of these two poles, you find the smaller worlds of the archipelago. South Caicos is the fishing capital, a place named Cockburn Harbor. North and Middle Caicos are a pair of greener, lusher islands, so committed to neighborliness they are connected by a causeway. This thin ribbon of asphalt is a critical piece of infrastructure, seemingly the only thing preventing them from floating off in opposite directions after an argument. Salt Cay is less an island and more a museum that forgot to charge admission. It is tiny, almost empty, and the ruins of the salt industry lie scattered about like the abandoned chess set of two giants. Here, the island's most prominent citizens are the donkeys. They wander through the skeletal remains of the salinas with a quiet dignity, the furry, four-legged descendants of an industry's collapse. They are the patient, silent inheritors of this place, like Penelope endlessly weaving and unweaving her shroud, waiting for an economic Odysseus who is never coming home. From salt to sand, an island's fortunes reversed. That economic savior never returned to the Salt Islands because he had found a more lucrative shoreline 70 miles to the west. The silence of the ruins on Salt Cay and the roar of development on Providenciales are not the result of a master plan, but a tale of what happens when one industry trips over its own feet, creating an opening for a flashier competitor to sprint past. For over 2.5 centuries, the center of this universe was Grand Turk. The island was a giant salt shaker for the British Empire, its identity and economy built entirely on a single crystalline commodity. This trade dictated politics and the daily rhythm of life until the mid-20th century, when the business became about as viable as selling horse-drawn buggies outside a Tesla factory. Gigantic, efficient producers elsewhere rendered the small-scale, sun-and-sweat operations of the Turks and Caicos obsolete. By the 1960s, the industry had crumbled, leaving the nation's capital with no economy, high unemployment, and the faint, briny smell of a bygone era. Grand Turk was a king suddenly without a kingdom. While the capital stared into the abyss, Providenciales sat as the archipelago's forgotten cousin. It was an underpopulated expanse of scrubland with no real industry, save for a 12-mile stretch of beach so ridiculously perfect it looked like a geological error. A few shrewd American investors saw potential in the sand, but the real lurch into modernity came in 1984. Facing the grim reality of post-salt bankruptcy, the government made a decision equal parts desperate and brilliant. They threw a pile of incentives at a French resort chain to build Club Med Turquoise. This wasn't just a hotel, it was a global announcement. Club Med instantly placed Providenciales on the map for travelers who previously couldn't have found the country on a map. Its success signaled to the world's hoteliers that these islands were a safe bet. A boom followed that fed on itself. The resort justified expanding the Providenciales airport. The airport brought flights. The flights brought tourists who demanded the luxury hotels, condos, and restaurants that now line Grace Bay. This construction frenzy created a colossal demand for labor, pulling people from the languishing economy of Grand Turk and the other family islands. In a few short decades, an internal migration rewired the nation's demographics, turning Provo into the crowded center of everything while Grand Turk settled into its role as the quiet, dignified keeper of history. It proves that you have to take island economics with a grain of salt, except on Provo, where you take it with a side of rum punch. The pioneer of Provo's luxury scene. Having absorbed the island's economic history, a dramatic saga of salt versus sand, our short drive felt like crossing a timeline. We left the bygone era of salt raking and entered the modern epoch of tourist harvesting, a far more profitable if less flavorful enterprise. We arrived at the Grace Bay Club, one of the first temples built to this new religion, when developers realized the island's scrubland held a 12-mile sermon of perfect sand. If Club Med roared onto the scene in 1984 to put Providenciales on the map, the Grace Bay Club arrived in 1993 to draw the map itself. It opened as the first all-suite luxury resort on the beach. This was a high-stakes gamble. The founders bet that sophisticated travelers would venture to an island that still treated paved roads as a delightful novelty. They wagered on a demand for exclusive quiet rather than the all-inclusive volume offered down the coast. The resort's most audacious contribution was its business model. It introduced the financial engineering that became the island's operating system for the next 2 decades, the Condo-Resort. Instead of building a traditional hotel, the developers conceived a hybrid. They built opulent suites and sold them to individuals, then placed those individually owned units in a rental pool for visitors. This elegant solution lowered the developer's risk, gave private investors a stake in the outcome, and created a self-funding engine for luxury construction. It was the blueprint that fueled the island's transformation. From its original clutch of suites, the club expanded over the years, adding whole new districts like the villas and the private estates. This growth mirrors Providenciales itself. By defining high standards in architecture, dining, and service, Grace Bay Club created the market it now dominates. A stay here operates less as a vacation and more as a field trip to the institution that invented the gold standard, polished it, and placed it behind a velvet rope. The price of paradise, a two-sided coin. Witnessing the polished machinery of the Grace Bay Club, an institution that effectively taught this island how to spell luxury, one is left to confront a pressing question. If you construct an entire reality based on the whims of people who consider summer a verb, who is left to buffer the chaises longs? I found the answer to this inquiry not in a textbook, but over a plate of chicken tikka masala. We had located a sanctuary of spice that delivered a meal of genuine excellence, followed immediately by a bill delivered with the somber gravity of a court summons. The document proclaimed a debt of $240. This was less a bill and more a small-print hostage negotiation. In that moment of quiet, wallet-clenching horror, the island's operating system became brutally clear. And, as we would soon learn, for Providenciales, this was a bargain. The island is a victim of its own stunning success. The same Condo-Resort model that Grace Bay Club pioneered, allowing someone from Scarsdale to own a slice of heaven, has untethered local land prices from local reality. For the island's native citizens, the belongers, buying a piece of their own home has become a financial impossibility. They have been displaced, pushed outward from the economic core that they keep beating. This creates a spectacular housing squeeze. The market builds infinity pools and ocean view balconies, not 3-bedroom homes for the families who work here. The real estate sector behaves like a spoiled child, refusing to construct anything that lacks a helipad. Geography compounds the issue. Nearly everything on the island, from gasoline to a humble gallon of milk, arrives on a barge or in a cargo hold. This imported inflation sets a baseline cost of living calibrated for a vacation budget. A tourist might not notice the premium on a carton of eggs, but for a local family it is a constant, grinding pressure. The very tourism that provides the paycheck also designs a life that paycheck can't quite afford. This is the central paradox of Provo. The island is a magnificent economic engine that has accidentally priced its own engineers out of the building. We wrapped up our dinner and fumbled briefly to confirm we all had our room keys. Getting locked out after paying that much would have added insult to curry, and called the day done. The sunset, at least, had been genuinely beautiful and entirely free of charge. Decoding the dollar of appreciation. That $240 Indian dinner sat in my memory, not for the expertly spiced lamb, but for the document it arrived on. After a calm verification that we all held our room keys and were not about to end the evening as indentured dishwashers, I examined the receipt. Affixed to the bottom was a mandatory 10% charge labelled service. This fee, I soon learned, was the opening gambit in the island's most complex social game, the riddle of the tip. In the sun-drenched bazaar of Grace Bay, gratuity is less a transaction than a form of psychological calculus. Restaurants and hotels apply that automatic 10 to 15% levy, theoretically a pool for the staff. Yet local custom insists you slip your server an additional 5 to 10% in cash for a job well done. This forces the vacationer into a moment of high-stakes mental arithmetic, calculating a tip on a tip while trying to process 3 rum punches. The civic duty extends far beyond the tablecloth. You tip the taxi driver for safe conduct. You tip the boat captain a healthy 20% for returning you to the dock rather than leaving you on a sandbar. You hand $1 or $2 to the young man checking bags at the IGA supermarket, a sudden social pop quiz you are guaranteed to fail the first time you attempt to buy milk. This system, with its blend of mandated fees and expected extras, appears to be the financial bedrock of the island's belonger preference policy. The strict rule prioritizes native Turks and Caicos Islanders for employment, a sensible protection of local livelihoods that inadvertently creates an unseen tariff on quality. When a job is protected by birthright, the motivation to provide service that is genuinely exceptional, rather than merely adequate, can waver. The obscure tipping structure acts as the free market's attempt to hack a family reunion. The alternative waited for us on Ambergris Cay. Moving to this private island felt like entering a sovereign nation operating under a strict no-tipping doctrine. This was not a suggestion. It was law. A service charge was baked into the astronomical nightly rate, creating a self-contained ecosystem where the friction of cash was banished. The goal was a single, unified organism working for the guest's comfort without the transactional pauses. Here, in this walled garden of luxury, the contrast sharpened. Grace Bay was the public square, a bustling marketplace of choice and inconsistency where you might secure a fantastic deal or find yourself hustled by a man selling seashells of dubious provenance. Ambergris Cay was the fortress. You pay an enormous entrance fee for the guarantee that nothing will ever be annoying. The island stands as a monument to the idea that the ultimate luxury is the freedom to stop doing math. My willingness to return there proves the efficacy of the model. I will gladly pay a premium to be insulated from the hustle, a decision that speaks volumes about consumer choice, and perhaps my own deep-seated laziness. So there I was, wallet considerably lighter and perspective notably heavier, watching the economic forces of paradise play out in real time. Sometimes the most expensive lessons come with the best views, and Grace Bay certainly delivered both. Next time on The Rise the Limit, we're diving headfirst into one of history's greatest mysteries. Where exactly did Columbus first set foot in the New World? Spoiler alert, those idle vacation thoughts about the explorer's landing might just unravel everything you thought you knew about 1492, and the answer could be a lot closer to our Turks and Caicos story than you'd expect. If you enjoyed this journey, the complete travelogue is available right now as a Kindle book on Amazon. conch and consequence. And if you want to come behind the scenes and get bonus content, you can join my community on Patreon. Until next time, keep questioning everything, especially when it comes with a $240 price tag.